this question comes from Maine. Ben Simmons to San Antonio, good or bad move? And I think you can look at it from either end of the spectrum where is it worth it for the Sixers to engage at San Antonio? And then if you're the Spurs, is Ben Simmons a player worth consolidating other players and assets into?
I've been dating back to the summer saying if there was a 2-team deal to be made, San Antonio was on my short list where I think they could have it make sense for both sides. I think honestly that ship has probably sailed at this point because DeJounte Murray would have been the main guy that you would want to come back in that deal. And I think his value has risen enough this season that, now it's probably not realistic. I mean, I don't know. I guess the question is what does Ben Simmons do for the Spurs?
Especially if they're keeping Murray as part of that equation.
Right. I don't think he elevates them into, maybe this year because the race for the 10th seed in the West is comically sad, but I don't think he elevates them high enough that they would ever become championship contenders. I think Ben Simmons, I keep saying this, but he's perfect for the Sacramento Kings because all they care about is getting into the playoffs. They'll say that they care about winning championships. They don't. They've missed the playoffs for 15 straight years. All they want to do is just make the damn playoffs. Ben Simmons is a great regular season player, especially when he's surrounded by enough talent. And depending on who the Kings sent out in that deal, he could play with maybe Tyrese Halliburton's still there. Maybe Rashawn Holmes is still there. There could still be the core of an interesting, fun Kings team in the regular season that's good enough to get the 10th seed. And then they'll get their brains beaten in the playoffs, but they don't care because they made it. But so I think from the Sixers side, if DeJounte Murray is still on the table, is absolutely worth engaging. I just don't think San Antonio would seriously consider that at this point.
I have nothing to add to that. So this is terrible podcasting at the moment. But if you're San Antonio, I would. And I know this is going to sound it's going to sound like a lot to Spurs fans. And I already know what Daryl Morey would say. He would say no to the offer. But if it's Derek White, Devin Vassell, Josh Primo, and let's say 2 firsts and a swap, I'd probably do that if I'm Philly. But what I took away from Daryl Morey's radio interview, and this is how he's always thought, that regardless, the Sixers deserve a ton of shit for how they've handled part of the situation. I also think that Ben Simmons deserves a ton of shit. And I also don't think that we need to comment or infer anything about his mental wellness, because if there is an issue there, I hope, he's able to work through it. So I'm not even I know people think that he's lying about that. However, to the Sixers' credit, I don't think that they should just settle, because this is their last best chance at getting a co-star for Joel Embiid. And so you either need to trade for that co-star using Ben Simmons as the anchor centerpiece, or you need to get a return good enough that you believe you can turn around and flip for that other player once he becomes available. And Daryl Morey, to his credit, has always thought along the lines of, I want the star because that's going to give us the best chance to win a title. And that's why I think he would say no to that offer. Do I think that maybe that's an offer because of the picks and, Vassell and Primo that you could turn around and maybe dangle future ones? Yeah, sure. But it becomes very hard to construct framework that I think makes sense for both sides if DeJounte Murray is not involved.
Yeah, I completely agree. I going into the season, I thought Murray, one of Johnson and Vassell, and then Thad Young as salary filler for Ben. And I would even throw in a first round pick back if needed. That's how much I was a believer in Murray even before the season. Again, now I don't think it's on the table. From what I've heard from the Sixers folks, they engaged with San Antonio. They never really got traction there. And I think part of it is, I think fit is going to come down, what we're hearing out of Philly. They just do not want De'Aaron Fox. And I think it's just,
I think that's a mistake, by the way.
FYI. I do too. But I think it's a large part is they are just looking at fit around Joel Embiid. And I think if they're bringing in a point guard, they want a point guard who can shoot. And for as good as Murray is, and I know he's taking, 4 threes a game, but he's only shooting 32.6% from deep. I think they want someone in the high 30s, low 40s, but, good luck finding someone who fits that criteria.
Right. And look, Murray has a real mid-range game, I think. But, De'Aaron Fox, he still remains a great finisher, even with poor shot quality. He's shooting 45% from mid-range on the season, and not this year. Last year, he hit, I can't even remember the percentage, but I'm going to say And even if it's too high, it was closer to 40+% than not of his step back threes. And so like, I would absolutely trade for De'Aaron Fox, especially if there's other stuff involved. That's your chance of like, it sort of, to me, would bridge the two ideals of, okay, we're not sure if De'Aaron Fox is the player that we want to pair with Joel Embiid long term, but by acquiring him, we help our chances now without damaging our ability to make monster offers on other players later.
Right. Yeah. Like there was the athletic roundtable, and then Sam Amick had this the other day where he's like, the Sixers are trying to attach Tobias Harris now to Ben Simmons trades. If they can't get that superstar in return for Ben Simmons, they at least want to get off of Tobias Harris's contract, which is very wise. And he was saying like, salary wise, you can do those two guys for De'Aaron Fox, Buddy Hield, Harrison Barnes. And then he added, but the Sixers would probably want more. And I tweeted that out because I was like, dude, if that is on the table, you call that in right now and you run away. Like, even if you view Fox not being the optimal return for Ben, there's not much difference, if any, between Tobias Harris and Harrison Barnes. I honestly might prefer Harrison Barnes right now to Tobias Harris.
What would be the argument for Tobias? Maybe he has a little bit better ball skills, but they're not, his decision-making has just been terrible this year.
Horrible. Yeah. And I mean, that's even without remove the contracts from the equation. Then you take the contracts into the equation, and like the upgrade in terms of flexibility from going from Tobias to Harrison Barnes offsets any potential quote unquote selling low. And for like Fox and Buddy Hield for Ben is already pretty decent value. Like that is more than anyone reasonably expected the Sixers to be able to get heading into the season. So again, we don't know what has or hasn't been offered. Daryl Morey is smarter than all of us, and he knows more than all of us behind the scenes. Like, I'm half convinced, given the rumblings coming out from Brooklyn about James Harden potentially wanting to leave this summer.
I'm sold on it. I don't try and buy into that stuff. No, I'm ready. James Harden's leaving Brooklyn this summer. Win or lose a title. He wants out. I'm there.
And like, honestly, who knows what the world is going to be like in 10 months. So it's hard to say.
Or if it will exist, even.
that too. But like, if the rules are the same and Kyrie has still not gotten vaccinated, why would you want to re-sign there? Of course you don't want to deal with that nonsense next year. This is already like, you're already putting on way too much of a minutes load this year because your teammate is being an idiot.
Right. And so look, he's tight with Kevin Durant, but Kevin Durant's, he missed half of last year, still has coming off the Achilles injury 2 years in his rearview, gets injured again now. Not his fault, but he's still one of the 5 best players in the league. But do you want to deal with that after and the other thing also is Kyrie Irving, he doesn't get vaccinated. It doesn't make it more likely that he leaves in free agency to go play for a team in a market where he can actually appear in as many games as possible.
Oh, that if KD is just,
am I wrong about that though?
Well, I don't know. I mean, he's still getting paid for the games that he's not playing, right?
And he might hate basketball at this point.
Right. Like if I could get paid and just not show up for half of my shifts, I'd want to stay there forever.
He's busy being the voice of the voiceless without saying a goddamn thing.
Right.
That's what he's busy doing. I want to get into this question because I'm going to tie it to this Ben Simmons discussion, but it comes from Caden. What should the Timberwolves look to change, improve this coming trade deadline? Who would be the assets to move if they made moves? And I want to frame it with this first is I personally think they're still league average on offense, still league average is above the break 3-point shooting. They can't make a corner three to save their lives when they're taking them. I think that's what they need. And I'm just curious as to whether you think the idea of Ben Simmons, Karl-Anthony Towns in the front court, forget about the cost of getting him. Is that what they need? Is Ben Simmons what that team, because my gut would say you only get Ben Simmons if you just don't buy into your defensive returns so far, because your defense has been, maybe it's overachieved this year, but it's otherwise, and I know you can't grab a defensive rebound to save your life apparently, but it's been fantastic for most of the season. Ben Simmons doesn't augment your shooting. He's going to shrink the floor in most cases. So I'm just curious as to whether, if they're waiting for Ben Simmons, my argument would be, I think it's time to move on. I just don't know if he is, I don't know if he is the guy. Yes, Karl-Anthony Towns and Ben Simmons make so much sense together. I just don't know if he is the answer for them.
Right. Right. And I mean, it depends on what the price is that they have to give up. Like if they could do it without giving up Edwards, Towns, or Russell, and it was like Beasley and Beverly and Vando or Jaden McDaniels and some heavily protected first. Like if you are able to convince Philly, like you have them backed into a corner and you're able to convince them to sell low on Ben Simmons, yeah, sure, then the price is right. But I agree with you that the fit with Edwards and Russell would be more of my concern than with Towns, because I just don't know. And this is going to go for any team that trades for Ben Simmons. You have to build around his specific strengths and weaknesses. But I think in Edwards and Towns in particular, the Timberwolves already have two long-term keepers, or two guys who they should hope are long-term keepers. So I don't know that they'll be able to fully build around Ben Simmons. I also don't know if Ben Simmons is a good enough player to deserve that kind of treatment unless you're just starting from scratch. Is he willing to operate off the ball more than he did in Philadelphia? Or does he still fancy himself as this full-time point guard? Is he going to take away touches from Russell and Edwards? Like maybe that helps optimize Russell. Maybe he can operate more as a catch and shoot threat. So I could see the appeal there. But, in the possessions where Russell or Edwards are handling the ball and Towns is in the post, what does Ben Simmons do? And I don't have a good answer for that question.
Yeah, and I would guess that Russell's probably gone as part of that deal, because how many picks are you including if it's McDaniels and essentially salary filler after that, if you're not giving up Russell for that to work? So what do you think the Wolves, is it what I outlined? Like, can they just get someone who's going to hit threes consistently and then kind of augment? Their offense has climbed to league average, so it's been better of late. But the name that springs to mind here, it was Harrison Barnes. I thought would be a perfect fit for this team. That's the type of player that, no, he's not Ben Simmons, doesn't have the same ceiling, but I'd be willing to. I mean, I don't even know if you have to give up the Ben Simmons dream to get Harrison Barnes. How much is he actually costing you? You're still probably being, and my guess would be you're moving Malik Beasley or Taurean Prince as part of the primary salary anchor. Do the Kings want the expiring salary of Prince? Or do they actually want to have Malik Beasley, who in theory is a good player, just hasn't been great this season? And then you're building out from there. My guess is you have Jaden McDaniels. Like you said, you have Vando. You also have Naz Reid there too, and then picks. And I think it would be, my guess would be for someone like that, you build out from salary filler and then maybe a player and a pick. Is it depending on the player? Does Jaden McDaniels alone get you Harrison Barnes? My guess is probably no, but maybe it could be Jaden McDaniels and a heavily protected first, or is it Naz Reid and a more loosely protected first? That feels like, if you're including Malik Beasley as the other part of this deal, feels like a fair price to pay, and also not something that forces you necessarily to punt on higher level trade talks in the future.
Yeah, no, I like that idea. And I think Harrison Barnes, like we'll hear Barnes and Grant, I think, bandied around a lot over the next couple of weeks. And I think, I said Grant earlier in terms of like the best player on paper to be traded, but I would, like, if the price is equal for those two guys, I would rather have Barnes. I think Barnes is a much more plug and play guy. And especially given what Jake just reported about Jeremy, like wanting to go to a team where he's still one of the primary offensive focal points, and B, wanting a 4-year, $112 million extension. Like those two things they might be red flags enough for me to just be like, nope, I'm out. Thank you. But I'm going to pivot to plan B.
He was probably seeing that the Dallas gave Tim Hardaway Jr. more of a 1.5 dimensional player, 4 years and 76 million, whatever. Basically the same contract he signed with the Knicks, the one that he had just came off. So I kind of get and he might have the leverage to get it wherever he's going, but I agree with you. I'd prefer Barnes. There's the extension looming for Grant, of course, but even if you had to, money being semi-equal or whatever, I would prefer Barnes, just because, like you said, he's more scalable, I think, than Grant is.
Yeah.
So let's wrap up the Ben. Well, maybe he'll tangentially come up, but the two questions would be, one, do you think he gets traded? What would be your prediction? And it almost makes me uneasy how many insiders are predicting a trade, because my stance is I don't think he's getting traded.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I mean, this is full conspiracy theory. Like, I have no proof of this, no insider connection. No one from the Sixers is leaking this to me or anything. But like, given the stuff coming out about Harden, just from all corners of insider world, it wouldn't surprise me if Daryl and, not to suggest that Daryl Morey and James Harden have any contact right now, because that would be illegal. They absolutely can't do that. But it wouldn't surprise me if he has some inkling that a sign and trade is possible. Or I wrote about this at Forbes earlier this week. Like, an opt-in and trade would actually be the best case scenario for Philly, because then they wouldn't have to worry about the apron at all. So I just, the way that he's going about this without having the urgency of like, yes, we must get rid of Ben Simmons by the deadline, makes me think he has something in his back pocket for the offseason. But I could be totally wrong. And maybe he, doesn't trade him by the deadline, hopes he's going to get a Beal or a Lillard or a Jaylen Brown or a James Harden, strikes out on all those guys and has to sell lower in July than what he could have got in February. Like, that is the risk of not cashing in right now.
I would argue it's probably a risk worth taking, because whatever decision he makes, it's probably not necessarily because maybe it's part of the reason. By the way, for anyone who's wondering, Brian's recording this from Daryl Morey's office. He said that he would, yeah,
at gunpoint.
Yeah. But it's not even just about the Harden. You mentioned them. It's to also, what if Beal? What if Lillard? Or maybe Jaylen Brown? What if someone else becomes available? And if they don't, you said the risk is they could settle for less. But when there's more than just the James Harden scenario at play, which for anyone who didn't read, Brian published an article too at Forbes about how the Sixers could do it while staying under the apron and not having to get Tobias Harris. But of course, the opt-in and trade would be a more ideal, or let's say more, it's ideal, and then it's definitely more convenient for Philly.
Yeah.
But he figured out a way to do it without having to include Tobias Harris.
Yeah. That was, because that was like, when all of this stuff started, I was like, all right, it just mentally, it felt like they would have to get rid of Tobias, but no, they can, if they would have to waive Danny Green and then trade Ben and trade Furkan Korkmaz, and they would have like less than $200,000 under the projected apron right now. So that the cap cannot come in any lower than projected, or this plan goes to hell. But there is a way to do so. Again, like, I just go back to, if they can get off of Tobias Harris at the deadline, and it is that Kings deal of Fox, Hield, and Barnes for Ben and Tobias, I do it. I don't wait for James Harden, because sure, maybe there's a chance that you could have gotten him this summer. There's also a chance that the Nets win the title and he resigns for 5 years. And like, as you said, Fox, I think if you're not totally sold on him long-term, you'll be able to move him. I also think like those guys, when I floated this at first, some of the reaction was like, well, why are you trading for like the core of the Kings? And it's like, well, the Kings don't have Joel Embiid. Like, the Kings suck right now and with these players, but there's a pretty good chance that if De'Aaron Fox is playing with the Joel Embiid, if Buddy Hield is playing with the Joel Embiid, they are better, they win more, their value increases. So I understand the Sixers' concerns about, is De'Aaron Fox that much of an upgrade over Tyrese Maxey? They are just super, super high on Tyrese Maxey. I get it. But at the same time, if you're just looking at it this season, because Ben Simmons is not playing for this team this season, even if they go past the deadline, I would be shocked. So you're effectively swapping Tobias Harris for De'Aaron Fox, Buddy Hield, and Harrison Barnes. Like,
3 top 8 rotation players.
Right. You're not going to find a more lopsided deal at the trade deadline if you pull this off. So that's where I would stand. If they could get off of Tobias, I would do it. I don't know if they're going to be able to get off of Tobias, so I think it probably goes into the offseason.
And I would, by the way, you could do that trade if you're Philly this season. And if James Harden or Bradley Beal or someone else, like, you can still turn around and then try and make another trade, because the Nets, if James Harden wants to leave, the alternative is losing him in free agency, or like they could build whether it's De'Aaron Fox, like you still have the assets to, unless James Harden's coming for sure, this wouldn't be a reason for me to not make that deal. And I wrote something where I don't know if I would make this deal as the Kings to where I would endorse it saying 100% do this, but I could imagine Tobias Harris just being better on a team that plays a little faster. And when he's going to have Halliburton and Simmons, 2 players who could simplify his role, I think more than anyone simplifying it in Philly right now. And I also, for the Kings, there's the argument to be made that based off how De'Aaron Fox has played for much of this season, and then also Buddy Hield, that those are two players who are not on net positive contracts. Maybe they're closer to net neutral than net negative, but you're not like giving up these steals. And so I don't think it's egregious for the Kings to think that way, especially if by moving these players and taking on Tobias Harris, you're not giving up picks and swaps, because that's the most dangerous asset to give up if you're the Kings based off your track record. And I'm not even trolling them. It's just a matter of fact.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. I hope Monty McNair is listening to this podcast. He calls up Daryl Morey as soon as we're done.
I want to see Ben Simmons play basketball again, and just as I want him to get traded, I just don't think it's going to happen. It's just where I'm at with this.
The Sixers also want to see him play basketball. Coincidentally, it's not in their hands.
The way I framed it is, I think it's more likely he suits up for them this season than he gets traded at the deadline. Would you agree? Or do you think it's more like, so you think it's more likely he gets traded because he'll just punt on the entire year?
Yeah. I don't think he's playing. I would be surprised if he ever plays a game in Philadelphia again, like home, road. I don't think it's going to happen.